this talk is called Tank Hunters, and the meaning behind that is if anyone's got any sort of like military history interest, a tank hunter is someone that goes and hunts tanks, blows them up. And it's kind of a double entendre, because building this project, we ended up sort of going and hunting stuff ourselves, and that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit. Basically, it's an indie scale project with an insane, like the idea was just quite crazy. The scope of the thing is out of control. It's honestly, if you pitched it to someone who's smart about money and resources and stuff, they'd just be like, no way. But that sort of became part of the story as well, of like, you know, how can we get a lot of stuff done with like basically no money, just people who really know their stuff. So that's kind of what the project is about at the core, I suppose. So what problem are we solving and why? There are a bunch of people who sort of like this, all this like tank related stuff became quite popular because of all these free-to-play games, basically. But it's kind of an interesting thing, because people started getting, you get this situation where people get into these kind of, like they get into a video game and they start looking up, like if it's based on a real thing, they start looking up all the details of that real thing and going into the lore, if that makes sense. Like it's real life, but it's like the lore of the game is like, it's on Wikipedia and stuff, you know. So you can actually find out all these things, and people get interested in like, okay, what's the real version of this? Like not the thing that's in the game, but like what's it really like? And this in particular, a bunch of people, well, maybe 4 or 5 people sort of converged on this like, let's make an authentic version of this tank stuff that everyone's excited about. And we all kind of a little bit spontaneously agreed that the interesting thing to cover was the Cold War, which was a time pre-90s where the world was basically split into 2 ideologies, and there was this whole everyone was kind of doing this big long broad scale like LARPing that the world's about to end because these 2 ideologies are going to clash and everything's going to be destroyed, and there's a lot of tension and anxiety and stuff about it, and that kind of shaped the world we live in now. Like if you look at all these things going on in like the Middle East and stuff, all that hardware that goes into those places, it came out of this conflict. So all the horrible things going on in the world, it's basically because some of the giant superpowers in the world got really scared of each other and started building tons of stuff, and it never got used for what it was meant to be used for, which was destroying each other. And now that's just part of our lives now, and it's just kind of it's culturally quite relevant to our generation. Anyway, nobody was really dealing with this in a way that we thought was interesting. We thought, let's give it a go. There were some games that sort of had, like, there were hints of, you know, that like they'd show a thing here, a thing there, but never in its proper context, and never really going into any of the cultural implications, like, you know, all this this demilitarization of the world and all this kind of stuff that sort of is the important part of that story. Not so much the you know, how many hunks of metal did the Soviet Union produce between 83 and 89 or whatever. But we found that the games were either doing that kind of, like, they were doing this they weren't digging into it and weren't really thinking about what was the story behind it. And we also thought the other alternative, like on the other end, was they were going really, really deep into like system simulation and stuff, and going like very pedantic on all the little gadgets and stuff, which we do as well. But not really, like, it didn't have a soul, and they weren't making art out of it. It was very much like a cold sort of simulator or whatever, and they weren't really saying anything with it. And plus they looked kind of bad, because a lot of those simulators, they're mostly pitched towards, like, they actually sell them to militaries for training and stuff, and it's always very, very heavily biased, like, oh yeah, our stuff's the best, and we don't need it to look good because all the military computers are crappy. So like, let's make it look good, and let's make it have a bit of it's saying something instead of just you know, I mean, training people is important, but it's also, you know, it gets funneled through this pipeline of military industrial kind of nonsense and shenanigans that colors it a little bit, and we didn't want that color, right? Anyway, that's our niche. What do we need to make sure that this is going to work? There are a few things that will kill the project before it even gets off the ground, and we needed to identify those first. We want to make sure that almost anyone can play it, right? I cannot overstate that. We, from the very beginning, we're like, let's make this run really fast on like OK computer, like Radiohead. We want it to run on an OK computer because then more people can play it, And if more people can play it, more people can talk about it. And then we won't need to start spending money on marketing and all this kind of thing. So it all comes back to like, we had no cash. We can't afford to market this thing. So like, let's just make it easy to play. And we almost went for this sort of pseudo shareware thing where you can just try it for free and then like, join our Patreon and you get some extra little bits and pieces. So we tried to really focus on that organic, like, get people playing it. And the art really needed to do a lot of heavy lifting there. We needed to get it working really, because it needs to look good. Otherwise, people will just play the games that look good and don't say anything interesting. But it also needs to, like, those games they have millions of dollars and huge teams, and they have optimization teams. And we don't have a thing called an optimization team. We just have to try and sort of get it working. And that kind of covers that slide, I guess. The other thing is that like everything needed to be optimized anyway, because we wanted to do this whole thing. We wanted to put everything in its proper context, which unfortunately, that involves rendering scenes that are like kilometers and kilometers of open space full of trees and all this kind of stuff. And that's really hard to render. Like any graphics people are just going to be thinking like, let's not do that. Let's do a desert or a moon or something. But we thought we'll just do the hard version because I don't know. I don't know why. Like, I guess it's the cool one. So we decided to do that. And then if we can get that working, we can do almost anything. Okay, let's try. So whatever, we had a go, and it sort of worked out. So that's summarizing what I've just said. It's got to look good, otherwise people will just go and play basically those free-to-play games, like the ones that, like, the Russians can produce so much stuff. They have so much money, and their labor costs are pretty low, and they can go to Kubinka or whatever and scan everything, and easy peasy for them. That we can't compete in terms of like making trillions of polygons and beautiful, rendered stuff. We could do pretty good, but if we wanted to have the throughput that they do in terms of content, no chance. Like, just no way we can compete that way. But it has to look good, right? It has to look right. And when I say look right, it's got to have the authenticity. So the other thing that happens sometimes is when people make this stuff, they'll go to, like, you can go and do your research and everything and go to a museum and stuff, but there's certain little things that you just don't pick up. Like a lot of the stuff in museums, they'll have like bits of the equipment are pulled off it, or, they don't have the stuff, the enormous amount of ridiculous luggage that was carried all over these things. Like, for example, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this vehicle down the bottom has like some, actually, maybe I'll put it on my slides. It's got some tied down like aerials and stuff and all that kind of thing. You don't get any of that in museums, and you just need to do the research, and you need to talk to the crews and everything, which I'll go into a little bit more as we go. So they're the two. That's the balance we need to strike. It needs to look good, and we can't skimp on that, like, the authenticity and making it grounded and having it, making it sort of meaningful and tied to reality. Because our lore book is Wikipedia and history books and stuff, and people can check. People do check. It's horrible. So first part, make it look right, because that's easy to talk about. It's faster. We had to solve fewer problems doing this. Make it look right, as in, make it authentic, right? It looks okay, right? So what do we do first step? We decided we wanted to use photogrammetry for a lot of things. This sounds expensive. When people hear photogrammetry, they think AAA, they think pouring tons of money into stuff, good cameras, all this kind of stuff, scanning in the void, and all these crazy videos of people doing insane, awesome techniques. Photogrammetry is really cool. But what we did was we kind of did like guerrilla photogrammetry in a way. Pretty much we started with everyone on the team sort of had a look around them. It's like, are there any like monuments and stuff? Because what they do is when these things go out of, like I said before, they made thousands of these things and didn't actually need, the apocalypse never happened. So they're doing nothing now. And a lot of them will be like parked out front, like of, returned servicemen's leagues and all this kind of thing. So we found anything that was close to us, and we went and did like sort of dodgy scans, like with our phones and stuff. And some people had a nice camera, so they'd go and do one or whatever. And we'd get scans that were not super great, but it was okay because we weren't actually using them in the way that you'd usually use them in an environment, right? In an environment, you'd go and scan like a tree stump or whatever, and you'd kind of retopo it and use it as it is. But what we did is we used it like a reference instead, because what happens is if you do this with blueprints and stuff you find online, it's usually they're sort of cobbled together by people who make plastic models, and they go and visit something in a museum, do some measurements, and half the time it's like this MC Escher stuff that doesn't quite fit together properly, and you've got weird curves and castings on some of them, and there's just no way you're getting that like right without having either original plans, which good luck, or going and scanning them, which we thought, yeah, that's achievable. So we first did it with the team, and then we also we basically do community like outreach kind of stuff. Like we find people who live in areas that they might have access to some of these things, And we're like, okay, we'll pay you, go and take some footage of this thing, and we'll develop a scan out of it. And it's worked wonders. It's done really, really well. The other thing is grabbing stuff off the internet. Sometimes there's people will do some photo walkarounds again for there's this whole thing of like people making these plastic models and painting them and stuff. And it's crazy how much stuff they get done. It's worth looking at if you're a texture artist. Watch the people that paint the little models because like they know their stuff. So we'd go and get those photos, and sometimes you could pull a scan out of that. But the really cool thing is actually going and doing it yourself. You go and have a look at the thing, and it adds a lot of meaning to the development process. First of all, it adds the authenticity for the player, but for the developer, you start to get involved in this sort of alternate reality game of like, oh, I found a thing that I can go and look at, or I'm traveling and there's something I can go and scan here, or there's something on eBay that I can buy, like some old, like we're buying like periscopes and gun sights and stuff because they're not restricted, they're just optics. We just buy this stuff and look at it. If like we couldn't find what a reticle looked like somewhere, so I just bought the site and we just took a photo, and it's like, okay, that's what it is. We got it. Like, it's very interesting. Like you have that, you get like you get to be physically involved with the thing that you're making, and it adds I don't know, it adds meaning to it somehow. It might sound kind of cringe because I'm talking about like, this military stuff, and it's not for everyone. I totally get it's not for everyone, but this also applies if you were doing something like, if you were telling some traditional stories or whatever, like there's a lot of push for that kind of like cultural stuff. And it's like, you've got to go and get involved with it, right? Like any subject matter that you're doing, get some personal experience with it, and don't just like use Wikipedia and stuff because it's so disconnected. And if you can find a way to enrich your development process with that sort of that real world, like the hands-on stuff, just go and do it. So we've got some video of some scanning I was doing. I went and found this thing. This is a leopard. We used to use these. They're kind of cool. And I'll show you what the scan looks like from a bunch of photos. There was a lot more photos than that. You need a lot of photos to make a scan. And it's kind of crunchy and kind of crappy, but like when you retopologize it, like just remodel over the top and everything's fine, right? It looks okay. Looks like the original object, pretty close. And you know that everything's sort of in the right space or right enough. And then this whole thing that we're doing of like doing the interiors and stuff, we can't scan those, but this is just showing how much insane madness we've been getting involved in. And everything's the right thickness, and it's just horrible, but it's fun. So, and this is me actually climbing around on this thing, filming like so you can see everything on top of it. Because the scans, when you scan, you walk around something and you don't necessarily get the top. So I was like jumped up and just sort of had a look at everything with the camera. It's just cool to be able to have that reference. I should probably move this video over here so I'm looking at the camera. That's probably better, right? Cool. Okay, next slide. All right, what do we got? Make it look right, part 2. So part 2 of this sort of experiential thing where we're sort of we're digging into the reality of what we're depicting and trying to understand it better is because this is a relatively recent thing. This was still going on in the 80s, this whole end of the world LARPing scenario where people were doing these giant exercises and pretending that everything was going to kick off and thinking each other are going to nuke everyone and all this kind of thing. The people that were involved in all those exercises and stuff, they're still alive and they remember their experiences. So we just talked to some of them. It's like you can find people from like former, Czechoslovakia and East Germany. East Germany is like pretty much a lot of what we're doing because it's the flashpoint was going to happen in Germany. So it was East and West. And we talked to those people who were actually serving there, who went there and did those exercises. And it's like, okay, what was it like? And there's photos and stuff. And when they did these exercises, they dressed up like it was actually happening. So it's almost like we can look at reference photos of this thing actually kicking off because when they did their exercises, everything was set up as if it was for real, right? Lucky for us. And the colors, the photos are all in color and everything, so it's nice, right? Primary source literature is available. I've bought too many service manuals for these trucks and stuff like that. And they're all in Russian. I can't read the Russian ones. I can only read the German ones. But that's really cool because they're like these old vintage books, and everyone likes old books, right? But it's adding to that sort of like you get it's meaning, right? You've got a real object that's this was once a crew's book that actually helped them understand their vehicle, and now it's helping us understand that vehicle so we can depict it in the game. It's a cool like connectedness in the history of it and stuff. We can also get the actual hardware, so all the like gun sights and stuff that I was talking about. Touch grass, etc. I just thought, everyone's talking about touch grass lately. So let's do that. So here's some stuff that people have been doing. This is some old screens, some documents. So I'll pause for a sec. The screens at the start, our shader guy bought like a weird, like really old school little CRT monitor, because one of the vehicles had like a thermal imager with a tiny little ancient CRT, like from the 70s or something, and he found something very close to it, and he just ran some of our like game footage through it. And he's like, okay, I'm just going to match what that looks like with the post-process shader, which is like, I don't know, you could argue whether it's worthwhile, but it's cool. So this is some documentation with some, this is instructions on how the crew is going to interact with the vehicle. This is some night vision, right? Original night vision from like the 60s or something, and taking some photos through it. So we make sure that the night vision looks like how it did. This is a site for a guided missile that I bought. It doesn't shoot anything, so it's fine to have. This is a headlight setup from, this is quite hard to see on a lot of reference images because it's quite, you know, all this stuff behind it, where all the wiring goes and stuff. I just went and filmed it. This is an engine from a Kiowa helicopter. I went and found one of those and just took some photos of stuff, did a little scan from it. We didn't put a Kiowa in, but scanned it anyway. This is manuals, more manuals. Got manuals of all kinds of stuff because they tell you things that you can't figure out by just like looking at pictures or reading people's stupid opinions online. Make it look good is the next part, right? So if we know what we've got to do, and we understand the subject matter, or we have people who understand the subject matter better than us. By that I mean Russians. So what we do is we make something, and then we wait for a Russian to come along and correct us on what a T-72 really looks like. They've been really helpful. They've been really helpful because their culture is very like all this stuff is very, very important to them, because it started with them like winning World War II against Hitler and stuff, and that was, you know, that's a huge culture point for them. And they became really, really proud of their armored stuff. So if you get something wrong in a Russian vehicle, you can be sure that there will be a Russian to come and tell you what you got wrong. So we get those right a lot easier than the American stuff. The Americans don't care. So I have to go and look at them in person, go and scan them and stuff to get it right. Little side bit. So once we know what we got to do, we got to figure out how we're going to make it actually look nice, how we're going to make it look a little bit AAA with our budget of very little money. So geometry basics. Sort of decided early on to do a low to high. This is a typo. This should say low to high. I'm dumb, sorry. We went with low to high because low to high is faster. We could go in and sculpt all these things and make them ultra beautiful and try to, you know, go crazy with it. But realistically, the silhouette is the most important thing. If you look at original documentation of how tank hunters were trained to recognize these things, and they call it threat recognition. They have books in it, and it's full of silhouettes. It's all silhouettes, and it's like, okay, if it looks like this and the turret's a little bit forward, it's this tank. If it's, you know, if it's got a thing hanging off it on the back, that's the commander's one, and all this kind of stuff. So the silhouette, they'd figured all that out already, and we're like, oh, okay, so maybe we should just do the silhouettes and make sure that that's right, and then the other stuff, like the brain, can fill in those gaps, and that's character modeling sort of 101. Which is cool. So mixed workflows. Like I said we were doing low to high, but you'll see I've got some footage, and it's more like don't get, like, anyone who's veteran to 3D art will know this, but if you're starting out, don't get stuck in this idea that if you're like, oh, I'm going to do high to low, or I'm going to do low to high. If you pick that, it doesn't mean you have to do it for the whole object. Just model, like, use the best technique that you can for the part that you're making. It doesn't have to be uniform, right? But generally, we're doing low to high on this stuff because it's just faster and it achieves a result that's perfectly acceptable. For reference, these things are about, each vehicle is about 30 or 40,000 triangles, which is like the competitor that we're trying to sort of, like, you know, be acceptable compared to is, you know, they're in the millions and stuff. But realistically, we can't do that because we want to show 10 or 20 of them at a time, and it's, forget it. Silhouette versus correctness. That's, again, silhouette should be the important thing, and there's a lot of things that you'll see in this little next bit of footage where it's basically like a quad strip or just a little cube or something, and it's like, it's totally not the correct geometry, but like just the way the light hits it and stuff, it looks fine. It's hard to explain. I'll show you. Floating geometry facilitates LODs and variants, so a lot of this stuff is floating as well. All these like little light fixtures and like towing hooks and all that kind of stuff, they're just floating and clipped in there. And if we want to LOD that, we just delete all the stuff that's floating, and the underlying mesh still has its integrity. But the other thing is, there's this hellish thing about, like, you make one thing and then it's like, okay, but the one that the Czechoslovaks made had like, it's different hinges on it. And someone really cares about that. So you've got to make sure that you can remove that and replace it with the correct one, you know? It's stupid, but we do it because it's like, it's cool as well. It's fun. Learning all this stuff and making sure it's right and everything. It's like this endless quest to get it right. Oh, the UVs, that's another key thing. These are all on 2048 texture maps. There's a little bit of like some of the luggage and stuff is like on a 1024 and it's shared with all the vehicles, but generally a whole vehicle's on a 2048 single texture, single UV set. We stack everything. Everything gets stacked like one wheel. Every single wheel is that one texture, but then we go UV2 and then use the second UV set to do like a camo paint or whatever on it, so that it's not like, you can break up that repetitiveness. So that was a little bit of a spicy trick. So let's look at some footage. This is just an example of one of the low res meshes and showing this hole where when the turret gets blown off, there's like a hole in it, but you don't see that often, so it's pretty low res versus the actual geometry of the turret. Again, silhouette here. So see this cap of this is a snorkel for when it goes underwater. It's crazy. That cap has twice the segments of the snorkel itself. This is the high res. You can see there's a mix here. There's some sub D, there's some of it's just low res with some chamfers on it, and it's fine. It doesn't look right, and if you're new to 3D art, you'll be looking at this thinking, whoa, but it bakes down fine. It's going to be all right. And then this mask thing, this fabric bit here, that's like very oh, hang on, I gotta pause. That fabric stuff on the front was that's like, we do Marvelous Designer and Blender and all this kind of cloth sim stuff. I say we do. Sadly, I'm not working on this anymore because obligations. But you know, this is what we did at the time. So here's geometry of this is called an idler. This is just a little roller that keeps the track going where it's got to go. But see the mesh there. All these little spikes, they're floating. They're just clipped into the underlying cylinder. And when we turn off that wireframe that makes it look really bad, it's like the illusion's pretty good, right? As long as the silhouette's right, you can make the most insane stuff and it's fine. Have a look at this wheel as well. This is using a lot of alpha clipping, which we'll talk about in a sec. There we go. So it's like all alpha cutout stuff for all these little holes and stuff, but the actual mesh is really coarse. This is an example of what I was saying with like see these little clips and stuff on the edge of these boxes. They're really, really simple geometry, but they catch light, and that immediately changes the silhouette. Same thing here, this engine decking. See how when you change the light, you get this really crisp, the details sort of resolve. If you texture those on and you don't make that geometry, even if they're 6-sided or 4-sided, if you don't make that geometry, they disappear if you look at it on a shear angle. You don't want to not have that there. And they do a lot of this stuff on characters, like they model all the buttons and stuff now, because then you can look at it from a long way away and it doesn't mip down and go blurry. It's still, you get like a crisp, like if you've got like shiny buttons or whatever. Oh God, hang on. I've got to go back. Punch through transparency. Cool. Silhouette is the king. That's if you get silhouette right, everything else will be fine. We do it on grills. That's the obvious one. Any kind of like chain link fence in the game, it's going to have some punch through transparency. Easy peasy. Any grills on an engine deck or whatever, same deal. Bolts, clips, and cables, a little bit less obviously. I forgot to get footage of something, but there was like a helicopter with a missile and it's got like a control cable on it, or 2 control cables, and I baked that down onto like a really, really coarse quad strip, and it doesn't look right, but like you bake it down and it's fine. And then you can do like, you know, physics on it, and because you've got so few verts, it's efficient enough that you can do some wobbly movement and stuff. Okay, so the big granddaddy of this technique, doing everything with punch through transparency, is the tracks. I didn't get any footage of the tracks because the talk was already too long. But if you look at all the tracks in all these images, and you'll see them as you go, these are not modeled. These are like quad strip bands, and they're all it's all slices, like a bunch of slices with alpha punch through. So it's kind of like one of those puzzles where you make like layers of plywood to form like a thing. If it doesn't make sense, I'm sorry, but it's the tracks are scrolling quad strips with alpha channels. So here's some examples of punch through transparency being used. This is the silhouette again, right? This is a low light. This is called a T62. It's an insane vehicle. This is the silhouette thing that we're talking about. Like it's got to look right in low light, and then when the light comes on, it's going to be fine, because when the silhouette gets filled in with stuff, with features, everything's going to be all right because the silhouette's right. And watch how the light changes across this thing, especially on the roof here. See these little cubes and stuff. Even though it's super simple geometry, it catches the light and it blocks the light. Blocks the light, so it's fine. Here's some floaters. All these things are floaters. You can just delete them if you want to LOD. Another example of like sheer, like grazing views. See these little hinges on these side skirts. All that stuff. It's dead simple geometry, little cubes and stuff, but like it just gives you something where if you're looking down at a sheer angle at something, that texture is going to map down and become blurry. But these little bits of geometry are going to keep it held together. Here's some little clips and stuff. That's like those are quad strips of about 4 tries. So it's a very cheap way to get that shape done. Use punch through. It's cool. It's very cheap. I think it might even be sort of almost free because you don't need to do any Z sorting. These are all, again, floaters. Make one of these things and then just instance it all over the place. You only need to make one. Just reuse everything. This thing's it's called a track heel or something for messing around with the tracks. All these little clips. Those are boxes. It might be hard to see the wireframes, but they're just boxes with a bunch of alpha on them. But they resolve fine because silhouette's what matters, right? What else we got? These little ring pulls for messing around with the engine deck. These are all that. So again, if that was baked onto the texture, it would nip down and become blurry and disappear. But because it's alpha punch through, it's going to stay really crisp, even if you look at it from sheer angle or a little bit further away. Okay, rigging. We used a lot of blend shapes where we could. You can't always use blend shapes, but blend shapes are really cool. The examples I'm going to show, we have guided missiles, and the guided missiles come in a tube. And when they want to fire another one, they chuck the tube away and put another one on it. It's ready to go. But they have to have fins so they can fly. But the fins like fold up when they're in the tube, and then they unfold. But some of them have like 8 fins, and we don't want 8 bones because then the engine's keeping track of those things, and we have to store them in the animation and all this kind of thing. So we just had blend shapes, and it's just like 2 copies of the mesh, one with the fins folded and one with them unfolded, or maybe 3 copies, one with like an intermediate so it doesn't look too warpy. And there was another one that like it curls them around the body of the missile, and it's like, imagine how many bones you're going to need to animate that. So we just animated it normally in the 3D suite and then just baked it out to mesh, like stepped animation. So yeah, here's some examples of that. It's kind of cool, these ones. It's called a toe. It's really low res, obviously, because it's like, this thing's flying at very, very high speed. This is slowed down hugely. These things are very fast, so 8 sides or whatever. And that's the fins popping out, and that's just a blend shape. Like there's no bones or anything in there. And there's the jets as well. They spew out as like starts small, and then the blend shape makes it big, and the rest is just done with a shader that scrolls the thing. Here's the unfurling boy. It's kind of cool. But again, doing that like efficiently without blend shapes would just be hell. The amount of bones that you need to use, that just no thanks. Used on tracks as well, because like I said, they're bands. We don't physically simulate them and have them actually going around the wheels. So we just use blend shapes. Anyway, baking stuff to the timeline. So a lot of complex mechanical interactions are sort of predictable. I don't know how else to word that. For example, you've got like, say the traditional one is you're playing an FPS, right? And your character needs to be able to look up and down. When they're looking up, their body supports the weapon pointing upwards, and when they look down, they tilt their whole body like this, right? And if you just grab the bone in their spine or whatever and just tilt their body, they're going to do this weird like rigid thing. They're not gonna move their shoulders and stuff, which is what a normal person would do. So what you do is you make an animation where you're starting all the way at the bottom or all the way at the top, and then you animate them smoothly through that arc of that range of motion until they're aiming the complete opposite direction, and then you scrub that timeline. Instead of running that timeline by time, you run it by what's the elevation that they're looking at. And we use that for a lot of stuff. Like there's some weird linkages and things like that we would usually have to use IK for. But like we're not doing IK on that stuff because it's predictable. It's when it's up, it's a certain way, and when it's down, it's another way. We don't need to do any computation on that. We just bake it down. I'll show you that in a video. And then the weirder version is some fake physics stuff. which I'll probably have to explain with the imagery going because it's a little bit funny. Let's have a look. So this is see all these moving linkages and stuff. If you watch there's a missile launcher on the right that folds up. It's got like a weird little cover, and it's all just insane. It bounces back into place and goes all warpy because it hits the end of the timeline and then it's snapping back. So that doesn't happen in the game, but that smooth motion upwards does. Same here. There's a weird little elbow joint that makes sure that this spotlight, that round thing is a spotlight, makes sure that it's aligned with the gun, because that's for illuminating a target at night. That linkage is what keeps them mated together. This is the thing in game. It's actually working. Looks kind of cool, and it's like driving around and everything's sort of nice and fluid. I'll pause this for a sec because like there was something we really tried to do with this. We didn't want to get into a situation where it was all about this like cold machinery that's like, oh yeah, cool, it's a tank. We wanted them to feel a little bit alive and treat them as characters. We wanted to make sure all the parts that would move, and everything sort of like it felt like they had all their proper equipment and like people were kind of almost living in them and using them properly. And this came all the way down to things like, see this length of track here. I don't know if it's going to be visible in this footage, but this bounces and stuff. Like we just weighted that to a little physics constraint that makes it wobbly and stuff. So the slack bits of tracker. So this is a dude reloading this missile launcher, and this is a more traditional example of so you can see in Unity, I'm just scrubbing that timeline of like looking all the way up and all the way down. Same deal here. Well, kind of similar deal. This is just an animation of a guy bouncing. It's only like 10 frames or something. So we've got a bouncing animation, and then we've got one where it shows a range of motion from him leaning forward to leaning all the way back. And we're mixing those using some, like, the variables are controlling these things. And we can map that to the forward and backward momentum of this vehicle, or to like how fast it's going to his bumpiness, right? So you can see he's sort of like, he's jostling around and stuff. The really interesting advantage of this, I'll pause for a sec, is you get full control over it. All his arms and everything, like if he's holding a control stick, he's still going to hold it even when he's all the way back. And you don't need any IK or anything. You just do the animation. You're like, okay, I want him to look like this when he's all the way back, and like this when he's all the way forward. And he's never going to clip into the chair or anything annoying like that. We don't need to set any special constraints on the bones or how far they can go. We just make it in the animation and it's done. Very simple, very, very simple. And it looks pretty convincing. Like, I mean, a physics thing might be a little bit more accurate, but like that can go to hell. We'll just do the easy one. Constraints and kinematics. This is the most computationally intense one, I think. We've got a few things that are controlled by, how long have I gone for? I'm up to like almost 40 minutes, I think. We've got a bunch of things that are controlled with constraints, like kinematic stuff, or we link it to physics bones and all this kind of thing. We want all the antennas to be springy and bouncy, and we want the tracks to look slack and like they're alive, and we want to make sure all this, like the way the suspension works on these things, they have like rods running through the hull of the vehicle, and the rods twist. And that's how the suspension works. And they have like swing arms hanging off them, these little arms, and then the wheels on those. So when the wheels bounce up and down, sorry, I should do this. When the wheels are bouncing up and down, they're actually bouncing on an arc like this. And that's something that, because most physics engines for games are made for traditional, like a car's wheel, you can approximate it as up and down because it's just on a spring, like a coil spring, right? But because these are torsion springs, we had to fake it. Everything's like this faking like hell. So I'll show that, show some of that stuff in action. I can't remember what's first here. Oh, this is a solid axle. Solid axle is a little bit hard as well. So these wheels we can simulate those as traditional like spring wheels that any physics engine has. That's easy peasy. But doing solid axle was tricky. This is the setup I was talking about. These little nubs here, these are the actual pivot point for the wheel. And then there's an arm that comes off this, and that wheel is going to swing on that arm, right? And the arm's attached to that rod that twists, and just the torsion of that metal is going to spring it back. So you can see that that's rigged up, and we faked everything. So the way it works is we're simulating a traditional video game physics wheel that just goes up and down. And then what we do is we get this swing arm, and we put what's called a look-at constraint on it. And it's going to try to look at the position of the physics wheel that's bouncing just up and down. So this is going up and down, and the swing arm is just trying to aim at it, right? It's just aiming at it, yeah? And then the actual video game wheel is invisible, but then we put a mesh of a wheel that's hanging off the swing arm. So it's actually moving on an arc, but it's trying to follow as close as it can the physics wheel that's just moving up and down. So we get like close enough, right? Like there'll be a little bit of difference because when it's swinging on an arc, there'll be slight translation forward and back, but it's so small that it's like, it's not noticeable. The other thing is, because it's a track anyway, the contact point is a flat thing. It's not going to affect the physics. So it's fine. These shock absorbers and stuff, they're just like literally a tube, and you just weight the bottom of it to the swing arm and the top of it to the hull, and they just look after themselves, kind of. You can see them moving a little bit. So this is a solid axle. This is hell. So if you watch this, I don't know how easy it is to see what's going on. I think everyone kind of gets how an axle works though. So what can go wrong is, like, you'd think, okay, yeah, we just make it bounce up and down like the wheels. But what happens if you get one wheel go down and one wheel go up? What does the axle do? It has to resolve this angle somehow. So the way we did this, which I think is the cheapest way to do it, and I don't know if it's standard, we just sort of winged it. I don't know how people usually do it in games. What we did was we had the wheel, the physics wheel objects, and they can do whatever they want independently. They're going up and down. And what we did is the axle has its pivot point exactly in the middle between these two wheels, right? It's exactly in the center. And we put a constraint on that to put it in the average position between these two wheels. So if one goes down, it's going to go halfway between them, as if there's a straight line, right? So half the problem's already solved. And then we grabbed this point and we said, okay, put a look at constraint. We're going to make it look at one of the wheels. Doesn't matter which one, because you look at one, the other end of the axle being straight is going to connect to the other one because it's halfway between the two of them. So midpoint, snap them to the average position of the two wheels, and then look at one of the wheels, and problem solved. It's not that hard. And then there's leaf springs on top of them, and they're just traditionally weighted to the wheel. It's no problem. Okay, what's next? Jiggly boys. So watch carefully. See the cabin versus the tray. See how it's like flexing? Yeah, see how it's flexing? It's not flexing, it's fake, of course it's fake. So the way we did that one is the whole tray, it's like, because the tray sits on the frame isn't flexing, we faked that. The frame should be flexing on a real truck. If you look at trucks going over bouncy, terrain, you see them, they twist like crazy. It's more than you would expect. But instead of doing that, we created the impression of that happening by just grabbing the actual tray of the truck, and we put that on a hinge joint and just added some spring force to it. So now when this vehicle is going, and if it torques at all, if it rolls, these things are gonna independently twist. And that's enough to give the impression, like I said, when we were looking at it, that's enough to give the impression that this thing is flexing and alive. That's the kind of stuff we want to like get through. We don't want things to look like it's just a mesh that's sliding around on the terrain. We want to look like all the parts are actually living. And that's why all this insane rigging stuff is happening. Okay, rendering and in-engine stuff. This is a lot of optimization. I don't have a video for this or anything, so we can wrap it up soon. But a few tips. If you didn't already know, a lot of people will already know this, so sorry for explaining stuff you already know. But merge the mesh parts into as few as possible. So each mesh renderer, or especially skin mesh renderer, that's going to be like another draw call. Like it's going to do them in series. If you merge them down into one thing, you get it in fewer passes, and that's a huge optimizer. Like I said, everything is in little parts so that we can change things out, and also so the workflow is a little bit less destructive. But we had to set up a thing where at the end everything gets merged down into like one or two renderers or whatever, because then it can do them in one pass, two pass, three passes, whatever. Fewer materials. This should be obvious to pretty much anyone who's done even a little bit of game art. The more materials you chuck on something, each one of those it's going to do another lookup and another lookup and another lookup. That's why we do one shader for the whole vehicle. Easy peasy. Hide parts that aren't visible. It's basically just culling, but all this interior stuff that you can see on the screen right now, this doesn't get shown unless we're actually looking at it. Of course, should be obvious, I think, but put it there anyway, just in case. So how did we do? We're doing okay. Well, the project's doing okay. In 2 years, it took us about 2 years to get the thing up and running and looking right. And it's now in the top 40 for games on Patreon, which is pretty good. Making about 10K USD a month from just people who like it and give us money because it's cool. Even though it's kind of like the game's not finished, it's definitely like, it's not something that you go, if you went and bought it in a shop, you'd be kind of mad. You'd be like, these guys haven't finished this thing. So we don't know what's wrong with people, but like they believe in the project. And that's kind of what the next slide is about, I suppose. Key lessons. So I'm going to go through all these points because this is probably the thing that's most likely to actually be useful to you. Like all that art stuff, it's like, if you're not doing something kind of nerdy, who cares? But like this stuff is was really interesting. Screen carefully and don't rush to find the right stuff. That's maybe a bit more obvious, but if you want to ramp up your production, it's very easy to fall into this trap of like, we need more people. Let's grab more people. Don't rush that. Make sure, especially if you're doing something that you want to have a bit of meaning and you want it to have some authenticity. This thing, like I said, military stuff is cringy to a lot of people. I understand that. I totally understand that. But like, you can do things authentically, or you can do things with like lacking like you can tell when people don't care. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is. If you care about the subject matter, it's obvious when someone else doesn't. So screen carefully and make sure you get people who understand what you're doing. Not just people who are like, yeah, I can do the thing, and they bash something out, and that's fine, it'll work. But the best value adds have always been people who are like, this is a cool project, I want to help. That's the best kind of stuff you can have. Even if like we've got our terrain guy. If you're watching this, we love you, terrain guy. He started with no experience in Unity, but he did some armor, the simulator armor mapping. So he understands stuff about terrains, and he was a military guy, so he kind of understood what kind of areas we're going to need and everything. But he picked up the technicals, and it wasn't a problem. This probably doesn't apply to programmers. Programmers probably need to be pretty good, and artists, if they're doing quite technical stuff, they need to know their things. But there's a lot of stuff that you can learn on the job if you have if your brain is switched on in the right way. For example, terrain guy, he understood the theory of it, and he understood the game, and he wanted to do the right thing, and he picked it up very, very quickly. So find the right stuff, find people who care about what you're doing and they understand what you're doing. Document what you do. This is a do as I say, not as I do. I'm putting this here because we failed to document many things. Our documentation would be pretty good, but yeah, try to document stuff, because basically you could walk down the street and get struck by lightning, and then no one knows what you've done. So explain like all this stuff that I'm talking about. People need to understand at least a little bit, like, yeah, how's this set up again? Fake everything you can get away with faking. Just lie, cheat, and steal your way through this stuff. Don't feel like a lot of people get fixated, especially new to game design people. They get fixated on, if you're going to do it, it's got to be like the real thing. It's like, nah, just, you want to give the impression of the real thing. It's smoke and mirrors, right? If the impression is correct, it is correct. Don't worry about it. It's a video game. Generalists are a benefit to a project like this. Probably obvious to most people watching this. If you've got a small team, it's a lot more efficient if people understand more of the pipeline. On a giant project, you have people looking at their little part of the conveyor belt, and they'll rivet a manifold together and push it to the next person and never hear of it again. And this can be quite alienating. Keyword, alienating. If you understand what you're working on, and you have better communications with people in other departments, you'll get pretty nice results. It'll just kind of happen on its own. Again, it might not work for all projects of all scopes, but if you're doing something with a small team, make sure you get some people who are kind of across a lot of things, or at least understand them, even if they're not super good at them. Minimize experimentation as you go. Sounds stupid because I've just told you all these weird things that we did, but what I mean here is each thing you do, make sure the question marks, the things that you don't know how to solve, try and do like one or two of them at a time. Because you get into this situation where if you pick the hardest thing that you're trying to create, that has the most experimentation and the most unknowns, you have to wait for all of that stuff to be fleshed out before you even know if the solution is viable. So experiment on like bite-sized things, do MVPs. So the way we built stuff, like the first thing we did was a truck, because trucks are cool, but also a truck just has wheels. Wheels are easy. Every video game's done wheels. Doesn't have any guns. We didn't have any gun stuff ready to go, so we're just like, let's just get a truck driving. Okay, we got a truck driving. Okay, now let's make a thing with wheels and a gun. Done. Okay, cool. That's one problem being solved at a time. And then when we've got those two things, it's like, okay, what if we put tracks on it instead? And then suddenly we've got a tank. It's like, okay, what if we put a stabilizer and we've got a more advanced tank? All this kind of stuff. Like, just try and solve do one experimental thing with each little iteration that you do on your project. because again, you don't want to be stuck in this situation where you've got a blockage because you've got too many experimental things in this feature that you're adding before you know whether it's viable. Build and reuse substance. The project wouldn't exist without substance. Simple as that. Every time I build something with this thing, I would be developing, you'd be doing all your manual painting and stuff, but when you get a cool thing in substance, you save that out, and then everything you make from that point on, you can be like, oh, I've already done something kind of like this. I've made some rubber or whatever, and you go, just grab your substance material that you set up, and you've got consistency and you've got reuse. So it's just awesome. Don't texture in Photoshop. You're crazy if you're still using anything but substance, honestly, at this point. I don't want to be a shill. They don't pay me anything. I hate giving Adobe money, but substance, it's just, you need to use it if you're going to do anything that's like remotely AAA-ish. Hearts and minds type stuff. This is interesting. Part of like our biggest disadvantage is also in a way our advantage, because people like this story of like a tiny team of people doing something that seems impossible. They really love that, and they like that it's so few people that they can talk to them, and they can reach out to them and understand everyone that's involved in the project. And it's like the personalities of the people who are working on it come through a little bit. People believe in the project because they're like, oh, these guys actually care about what they're doing, and they're doing something really cool that should be impossible, but they're doing these superhuman feats to get it done. And it's totally not superhuman. We kind of knew that it was going to work if we stuck to it and got it right, because our backgrounds were we've done a lot of stuff. Like I've done a lot of AAA. A lot of the other guys have done simulation stuff or quite high end things. So we're like, we can probably do this. But the story of it's a Herculean effort is it's quite appealing to people, and they like knowing you, engage with community, all that kind of thing. Remember, screenshots are marketing. The graphics don't really matter. Nobody really cares, but they might not click on your game at all if it doesn't look good. That's the problem. If the game is good, they'll like it even if it looks like arse, but you got to get them to click on it in the first place. Now, there's an interesting aside to that. As soon as so when this project started, it was a mess thing not a mess, but it was thrown together by one guy with a bunch of possibly dubiously ripped models and stuff. And everyone understood that it was like, they looked at it and they understood it, and they're like, yeah, this is like a little prototype that someone's doing. And then I sort of was like, let's make this look good. And we started making it look good. And then when we started making it look good, their expectations started raising, because the presentation of the product, as soon as it starts looking a little bit better, people are like, oh, okay, you're taking this seriously, so I'm going to start taking this seriously too. And they started requesting all this insane stuff. Oh my God, it was hell. Like the Russians were out of control. They're zooming in on these tiny little parts of these tanks and stuff, and being like, oh, this shouldn't be like this. This was only in 1989, not in 1985. All this insane stuff, but the expectations rose. So that's the interesting thing. Be ready for that. If you're trying to build something that looks quite professional and looks well put together, the better you make that thing look, the more people are going to expect you to be able to do whatever they think is a cool idea. We had experienced that one, but it's worth it. It's very good. Just be ready. Just be ready to tell people no. Tell people that's not important. Please go outside. All that kind of thing. All right. But ultimately, if you make the game fun, no one's going to care. There'll be people who will get mad and be like, yeah, you should make this better, and everyone's going to want the game to be better, including you. It's only a bit hurtful when it comes from people who haven't gone through the hell of making it work at all, only to be told by someone it's not quite exactly what I wanted. But you got to roll with the punches, and it's fine. And if you just stick at it and make the game fun, people will believe in you, and you can keep doing it. Anyway, that's it.